Day 2 of reading India After Gandhi by Ramchandra Guha. Prologue. Unnatural Nation. 1. Because they are so many and so various, the people of India are also divided. It appears to have always been so. In the spring of 1827, the poet Mirza Asdullah Khan Ghalib set out on a journey from Delhi to Calcutta. 6 months later, he reached the holy Hindu city of Banaras. Here, he wrote a poem called Chirag-e-Dair, Temple Lamps, which contains these timeless lines. Said I one night to a pristine seer, who knew the secrets of whirling time, Sir, you well perceive that goodness and faith, fidelity and love, have all departed from this sorry land. Father and son are at each other's throat. Brothers fight brother. Unity and federation are undermined. Despite these ominous signs, why has not doomsday come? Why does not the last trumpet sound? Who holds the reins of the final catastrophe? Ghalib's poem was composed against the backdrop of the decline of the Mughal Empire. His home territory, the Indo-Gangetic Plain, once ruled by a single monarch, was now split between contending chiefdoms and armies. Brother was fighting brother. Unity and federation were being undermined. But even as he wrote, a new and foreign power was asserting its influence across the land in the form of the British, who were steadily acquiring control of the greater part of the subcontinent. Then, in 1957, large sections of the native population rose up to what the colonists called the Sepoy Mutiny, and Indian nationalists have referred to as the First War of Indian Independence. Some of the bloodiest fighting was in Ghalib's hometown. Delhi is still nominally the capital of Mughals and in time to become the capital of the British Raj as well. His own sympathies were divided. He was the recipient of a stipend from the new rulers, yet a product of Mughal empire and refinement. He saw more clearly than the British colonists did then or the Indian nationalist does now that it was impossible here to separate right from wrong, that horrible atrocities were being committed by both sides. Marooned in his home, he wrote a melancholy account of how Must Hindustan has become the arena of the mighty Warland and the blazing fire. To what new order can the Indian look with joy? He asked. An answer to this question was forthcoming. After the events of 1857, the Crown took over control of the Indian colonies. A sophisticated bureaucracy replaced the somewhat ad hoc and haphazard administration of the old East India Company. New districts and provinces were created. The ruling of the state was overseen by elite cadres of Indian civil services, supported by Department of Police, Forest, Irrigation, Civil Service, etc. Much energy and money was spent on building a railway network that crisscrossed this land. This contributed enormously to the unity of British India as well as its stability, for now the rulers could quickly move troops to forestall any repeat of the 1857. 2. By 1888, the British were so solidly established in India that they could anticipate, if not a 1,000-year Raj, at least a rule that extended well beyond their own lifetime. In that year, a man who had helped put the Raj in place gave a series of lectures in Cambridge which were later published in book from under the simple title India. The man was John Starchy. Starchy had spent many years in the subcontinent, ultimately becoming a member of the Governor-General's Council. Now, in retirement in England, he sat his Indian experience against the background of recent political development in Europe. Large chunks of Starchy's books are taken by an administrative history of the Raj, of its army and civil services, its land and taxation policies, the peculiar position of the native states. This was a primer for those who might work in India after coming down from Cambridge. But there was also a larger theoretical argument to the effect that India was merely a label of convenience, a name which we give to a great region including a multitude of different countries. In Starchy's views, the differences between the countries of Europe were much smaller than those between the countries of India. Scotland is more like Spain than Bengal is like the Punjab. In India, the diversity of race, language, and religion were far greater. Unlike in Europe, these countries were not nations, they did not have a distinct political or social identity. This, Starchy told his Cambridge audience, is the first and the most essential thing to learn about India. That there is not and never was in India, or even any country of India possessing, according to any European ideas, any sort of unity, physical, political, social, or religious. There was no Indian nation or country in the past, nor would there be one in the future. Starchy thought it conceivable that national sympathies may arise in particular Indian countries, but they should never extend to India generally, that men of the Punjab, Bengal, the northwestern provinces, and Madras should ever feel that they belong to one Indian nation is impossible. You might, with as much reason and probability, look forward to a time when a single nation will have taken the place of the various nations of Europe. Estanchi's remarks were intended as a historical judgment. At the time, new nations were vigorously identifying themselves with the Europe on the basis of shared language or territory, whereas none of the countries that he knew in India had displayed a comparable national awakening. But we might also read them as a political exhaustion, intended to stifle the will of those in his audience who would end up in the service of the Raj. For the rise of every new nation in India would mean a corresponding diminution in the power and the prestige of empire. Ironically, even as he spoke, Starchy's verdict was being disputed by a group of Indians. These had set up the Indian National Congress, a representative body that asked for a greater say for natives in the running of their affairs. As the name suggested, this body wished to unite Indians across the divisions of culture, territory, religion, and language, thus to construct what the colonists thought inconceivable, namely a single Indian nation. Very many good books have been written on the growth of the Indian National Congress, on its move from debating clubs through mass movement to political party, on the part played by leaders such as Gokhale, Tilak, and above all, Gandhi in this progression. Attention has been paid to the building of bridges between linguistic communities, religious groupings, and caste. These attempts were not wholly successful, for low caste and especially Muslims were never completely convinced of the Congress's claims to be a truly national party. Thus, it was that when political independence finally came in 1947, it came not to one nation but two, India and Pakistan. This is not the place to rehearse the history of Indian nationalism. I need only note from the time the Congress was formed right up to when India was made free and divided. There were skeptics who thought that Indian nationalism was not a natural phenomenon at all. There were, of course, British politicians and thinkers who welcomed Indian self-rule and, in their own way, aided its coming into being. One of the prime movers of the Indian National Congress was a colonial official of Scottish parentage, A.O. Hume. Yet, there were many others who argued that, unlike France or Germany or Italy, there was here no national essence, no glue to bind the people and take them purposefully forward. From this perspective stemmed the claim that it was only British rule that held India and the Indians together. Among those who endorsed John Starchy's views that there could never be an independent Indian nation were writers both famous and obscure. Prominent in the first category was Rudyard Kipling, who had spent his formative years in and was to write some of the finest stories about the subcontinent. In November 1991, Kipling visited Australia, where a journalist asked him about the possibility of self-governance in India. "Oh no," he answered. "They are 4,000 years old out there, much too old to learn that business. Law and order is what they want, and we are there to give it to them, and we give it to them straight." Where Kipling laid emphasis on the antiquity of the Indian civilization, other colonists stressed the immaturity of the Indian mind to reach the same conclusion, namely that Indians could not govern themselves. A cricketer and tree planter insisted after 40 years there that chaos would prevail in India if we were ever so foolish to leave the natives to ruin their own show. Yeah, gods, what a salad of confusion, of bungle, of mismanagement, and far worse would be the instant result. These grand people will go anywhere and do anything if led by us. Themselves, they are still infants as regards governing or statesmanship, and their so called leaders are the worst of the lot. Views such as these were widely prevalent among the British in India and among the British in home as well. Politically speaking, the most important of these stanchions was undoubtedly Winston Churchill. In the 1940s, with Indian independence manifestly around the corner, Churchill grumbled that he had not become the king's first minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. A decade previously, he had tried to rebuild a fading political career on the plank of opposing self-government for Indians. After Gandhi's salt satyagraha of 1930 and protest against taxes on salt, the British government began speaking with Indian nationalists about possibility of granting the colony dominion status. This was vaguely defined with no timetable set for its realization. Even so, Churchill called the idea not only fantastic in itself but criminally mischievous in its effects. Since Indians were not fit for self-government, it was necessary to marshal the sober and resolute forces of the British Empire to stall any such possibility. In 1930 and 1931, Churchill delivered numerous speeches designed to work up in most unsober form the constituency opposed to independence from India. Speaking to an audience at the City of London in December 1930, he claimed that if the British left the subcontinent, then an army of white Janissaries, officered if necessary from Germany, will be hired to secure the armed ascendancy of the Hindus. 3 months later, speaking at the Albert Hall on our duty to India, with his kinsman, the Duke of Marlborough, presiding, Churchill argued that to abandon India to the rule of the Brahmins, who, in his opinion, dominated in the Congress party, would be an act of cruel and wicked negligence. If the British left, he predicted, then the entire gamut of public services created by them, the judicial, medical, railway, and public works department would perish, and India will fall back quite rapidly through the centuries into the barbarism and privations of the Middle Ages. 3. A decade and a half later, after Winston Churchill issued these warnings, the British left India. A time of barbarism and privatization did ensue, the blame for which remains a matter of much dispute. But then some sort of order was restored. No Germans were necessary to keep the peace. Hindu ascendancy, such as it was maintained not by force of arms but through regular elections based on universal adult franchise. Yet, throughout the 60 years since India became independent, there has been speculation about how long it would stay united or maintain the institution and processes of democracy. With every death of a prime minister has been predicted the replacement of democracy by military rule. After every failure of the monsoon, there has been anticipated countrywide famine. In every new secessionist movement has been seen the disappearance of India as a single country. Among these doomsayers, there have been many Western writers who, after 1947, were as likely to be as American as British. Notably, India's existence has been a puzzle not just to casual observers or commercial journalists. It has also been an anomaly for academic political science, according to Ho's anxious cultural heterogeneity and poverty do not make a nation, still less a democratic one. That India could sustain democratic institutions seems, on the face of it, highly improbable, wrote the distinguished political scientist Robert Dahl, adding, it lacks all the favorable conditions. India has a well established reputation for violating social scientific generalizations, wrote another American scholar, adding, nonetheless, the finding of this article furnished grounds for skepticism regarding the viability of democracy of India. The pages of these books are prepared with forecast of India's imminent dissolution or of its descent into anarchy or authoritarianism rule. Here, let me quote only a prediction by a sympathetic visitor, the British journalist Don Taylor, writing in 1969, by which time India had stayed united for two decades and gone through 4 general elections. Taylor yet thought that the key question remains, can India remain in one piece or will it fragment? When one looks at this vast country and its 524 million people, the 15 major languages in use, the conflicting religions, the many races, it seems incredible that one nation could ever emerge. It is difficult to even encompass this country in the mind. The great Himalayas, the wide Indo-Gangetic plains burned by sun and savaged by the fierce monsoon rain, the green flooded delta of the east, the great cities like Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. It does not often seem like one country, and yet there is a resilience about India which seems an assurance of survival. There is something which can only be described as an Indian spirit. I believe it no exaggeration to say that the fate of Asia hangs on its survival. The heart hoped that India would survive, but the head worried that it would not. The place was too complicated, too confusing. A nation, one might say, that was unnatural. In truth, ever since the country was formed, there have also been many Indians who have seen the survival of India as being on the line. Some, the patriot, speaking or writing in fear; others, the secessionist or revolutionaries, with anticipation. Like their foreign counterparts, they have come to believe that this place is far too diverse to persist as a nation and much too poor to endure as a democracy. 4. In the last decade of the last century, I became a resident of Ghalib's native city. I lived, however, not in the old walled town where his family, Haveli, or mansion still stands, but in New Delhi, built as an imperial capital by the British, as in the poet's day India was fighting Indian. On my way to work, I had to pass through Rajpath, formerly Kingsway, the road whose name and location signal the exercise of a state power. For about a mile, Rajpath runs along flat land. On either side are spacious grounds meant to accommodate the thousands of spectators who come for the annual Republic Day parade. The road then ascends a hill and reaches the majestic sandstone buildings known as the North and South Blocks, which house the officers of the Government of India. The road ends in the great house where the Viceroy of British India once lived. By the time I moved to New Delhi, the British had long departed. India was now a free and sovereign republic, but not, it seemed, an altogether happy one. The signs of discord were everywhere, notably on Rajpath, where the grounds meant to be empty except on ceremonial days had become a village of tents, each with colorful placards hung outside it. One tent might be inhabited by the peasants from the Uttarakhand Himalaya seeking a separate province, a second by farmers from Maharashtra fighting for a higher price for their produce, a third by residents of the southern Konkan coast urging their languages be given official recognition by inclusion in the 8th schedule of the Constitution of India. The people within these tents and the causes they upheld were ever changing. The hell peasant might be replaced by industrial workers protesting retrenchment, the Maharashtra farmers by the Tibetan refugees asking for Indian citizenship, the Konkani speakers by Hindu monks demanding a ban on cow slaughter. In the early 90s, these tents were summarily dismantled by the government, worried about the impression made on foreign visitors by such open expression of dissent. Rajpath was vacated of encroachments and the lawns restored to their former glory. But the protesters regrouped and relocated. They now placed themselves a mile to the northwest, next to the Jantar Mantar Observatory in the Connaught Place. Here, they were away from the eyes of the state, but directly in views of the citizen who daily passed through this busy shopping district. In 1998, the police decided this was not do either. The shanties were once again demolished, but as a newspaper reported, added, as far as the authorities are concerned, only the venue has changed. The problem persists. The squatters are merely to be shifted to an empty plot at the Mandir Marg Shankar Road crossing, where they are likely to draw less attention. When I lived in Delhi in the 1990s, I wished I had the time to walk on Rajpath every day from the 1st of January to the 31st of December, chronicling the appearance and disappearance of the tents and their residents. That would be the story of India as told from a single street and in a single year. The book that is now in your hands follows a different method. Its narrative extends over 6 decades, from 1947 to the present. However, like the book that I once intended to write, based on a year spent walking up and down Rajpath, this too is a story, above all, of social conflicts, of how those arise, of how they are expressed, and how their resolution is sought. These conflicts run along many axes, among which we may, for the moment, single out 4 as preeminent. First, there is caste, a principal identity for many Indians, defining whom they might marry, associate with, and fight against. Caste is a Portuguese word that conflates 2 Indian words, jati, the endogamous group one is born into, and varna, the place that group occupies in the system of social stratification mandated by the Hindu scriptures. There are 4 varnas, with the former untouchables constituting a 5th, and lowest strata. Into these varnas fit the 3,000 and more jatis, each challenging those in the same region that are ranked above it and being in turn challenged by those below. Then there is language. The Constitution of India recognizes 22 languages as official. The most important of these is Hindi, which in one form or another is spoken by upwards of 400 million people. Others include Telugu, Kannada, Tamil, Malayalam, Marathi, Gujarati, Oriya, Punjabi, Bengali, and Assamese, each of which is written in a distinct script and boasts many millions of native speakers. Naturally, national unity and linguistic diversity have not always been to be compatible. Indians speaking one tongue have fought with Indians who speak another. A third axis of conflict is religion. A vast majority of the billion-plus Indians are Hindus, but India also has the second largest population of Muslims in the world, about 140 million. Only Indonesia has more. In addition, there are substantial communities of Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains. Since faith is as fundamental a feature of human identity as language, it should scarcely be a surprise that Indians worshipping one variation of God have sometimes quarreled with Indian worshipping another. The fourth major axis of conflict is class. India is a land of unparalleled cultural diversity, but also, less appealingly, of massive social disparities. There are Indian entrepreneurs who are fabulously wealthy, owning huge homes in London and New York, yet fully 26% of the country's population, about 300 million individuals, are said to live below the official poverty line. In the countryside, there are deep inequalities in the land holding. In the city, wide divergence is income. Not unexpectedly, these asymmetries have fueled many movements of opposition. These axes of conflict operate both singly and in tandem. Sometimes a group professing a particular faith also speaks a separate language. Often, the low caste are the subordinate classes as well. And to these 4 central axes, one should perhaps add a 5th one that cuts right across them, that of gender. Here again, India offers the starkest contrast. A woman served as a prime minister for a full 15 years. Yet, in some parts of India, female infanticide is still very common. Landless laborers are paid marriage wage, the women among them the lowest of all. Low caste face social stigma, the women among them most of all. And the holy men of each religion tend to assign their women as inferior position to both this world and the next. As an axis of discrimination, gender is even more pervasive than other, although it has not so often expressed itself in open and collective protest. As a laboratory of social conflict, the India of the 20th century, for the historian, at least as interesting as the Europe of the 19th. In both, the conflicts were produced by the conjunctions of two truly transformative processes of social change: industrialization and the making of modern nation states. In India, the scope for competition has been ever greater. In India, the scope for contention has been ever greater, given the diversity of competing groups across religion, caste, class, and language. Conflicts are also more visible in the subcontinent since, unlike 19th century Europe, contemporary India is a democracy based on adult suffrage with a free press and a largely independent judiciary. At no other time or place in human history have social conflicts been so richly diverse, so vigorously articulated, so eloquently manifest in art and literature, or addressed with such directness by the political systems and the media. One way of summarizing the history of independent India and the contents of this book would be through a series of conflict maps. One might draw a map of India for each decade, with the conflicts then prevalent marked in various colors depending on their intensity. Blue for those that democratically advanced the interest of a particular group, red for those that more aggressively, yet still non-violently, asked for a major change in the law, black for those that seek the destruction of the Indian state by armed insurrection. Reading these maps chronologically, one would find major variations across the decades, with red areas becoming black, black areas becoming red, and blue and red areas becoming white. That being the color of those parts in India where there appears to be no major conflict at all. These maps would present a vivid kaleidoscope of changing colors. But amid all the changes, discerning observer would also notice that two things remain constant. The first is that the shape of the map does not change through all its iterations. This is because no part of India has successfully left India. The second is that at no time do the blue, red, and black areas taken together anywhere approximate the extent of the white areas of the map. Even in what were once known as the dangerous decades, much more than 50% of India was comfortably at peace with itself. The press nowadays, broadsheet and tabloid, pink and white, Indian and Western, is chock full of stories of India's economic success. This reckoned to be so much at odds with its past history of poverty and deprivation. However, the real success story of modern India lies not in the domain of economics but in that of politics. The saluting of India's software boom might be premature. We do not yet know whether this will lead to a more general prosperity among the masses. But that India is still a single nation after 60 testing years of independence and that it is still largely democratic, there are facts that should compel our deeper attention. A recent statistical analysis of the relationship between democracy and development in 135 countries found that odds against democracy in India were extremely high. Given its low level of income and literacy and its high level of social conflict, and India was predicted as a dictatorship during the entire period of the study ranging from 1950 to 1990. Since in fact it was a democracy practically the entire period studied, there was only one way to characterize India, namely as a major outlier. To explain this anomaly, this paradox, one needs perhaps to abandon the methods of statistical social science, in which India will always be the exception to the rule, in favor of the more primitive techniques of the narrative historian. The forces that divide India are many. This book pays due attention to them. But there are also forces that have kept India together, that have helped transcend or contain the cleavages of class and culture, that so far at least have nullified those many predictions that India would not stay united and not stay democratic. These moderating influences are far less visible. It is one aim of this book to make them more so. I think it premature now to identify them. They will become clearer as the narrative proceeds. Suffice it to say that they have included individuals as well as institutions. 5. The period of Indian history since 1947, writes the political theorist Sunil Khilanani, might be seen as the advance of a political idea, democracy. Viewed thus, independent India appears as the third moment in the great democratic experiment launched at the end of the 18th century by the American and French revolutions. Each of these experiments released immense energies, each raised towering expectations, and each has suffered tragic disappointments. While the Indian experiment is the youngest, says Khilnani, its outcome may well turn out to be the most significant of them all, partly because of its sheer human scale and partly because of its location. A substantial brigade of efforts went liberty on the Asian continent. As an Indian, I would like to think that democracy in India will turn out to be more significant than comparable experiments in West. As a historian, I know only that it is much less studied. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of books on the French and American revolutions, biographies of their leaders, famous and obscure, studies of the social background of those who participated in them, assessments of their deepening or degradation in the decades and centuries that followed. By contrast, the works by historians on any aspect of Indian democracy can only be counted on the fingers of one hand, or if one is more open-minded, two. The educationist Krishna Kumar writes that for Indian children, history itself comes to an end with partition and independence, as a constitution of social studies, and later on as a subject in its own right. History runs right out of content in 1947. All that has happened during the last 55 years may filter through the measly civic syllabus, popular cinema and television. History as a formally constitutional knowledge of the past does not cover it. If, for Indian children, history comes to an end with independence and partition, this is because Indian adults have mandated it that way. In the academy, the discipline of history deals with past, while the disciplines of political science and sociology deals with the present. This is the conventional and in many ways very logical division. The difficulty is that in the Indian Academy, the past is defined as a single immovable date, 15th of August 1947. Thus, when the clock struck midnight and India became independent, history ended and political science and sociology began. In the decades since 1947, the present has moved on. Political scientists studied the first general election of 1952 and then the next one held 5 years later. Social anthropologists wrote accounts of Indian villages in the 1950s and then some more in 1960s. The past, however, has stayed fixed. By training and temperament, historians have restricted themselves to the period before independence. A vast literature grew and is still growing on the social, cultural, political and economical consequences of British colonialism. As even more vast literature grew and is still growing on the forms, functions, causes and consequences of the opposition to colonial rule. Leading that opposition was the social reformer, a spiritualist, prophet and political aggregator Mohandas Karamchandra Gandhi. Gandhi was and remains greatly admired by some and cordially detested by others. Much the same would be said of the monumental edifice he opposed, the British Raj. The British finally left India in August 1947. Gandhi was assassinated by a fellow Indian in bare 5.5 months later. That the demise of the Raj was followed so quickly by the death of its most celebrated opponent has had a determining influence on the writing of history. One cannot say whether, if Gandhi had lived on much longer, historians would have shown greater interest in the history of free India. As it turned out, by custom and convention, Indian history is seen as ending on 15th of August 1947. Although biographies of the Mahatmas are allowed a 6 months extension, thus many fine as well as controversial books have been written on the last intense conflict-filled years of British India. That great institution, the British Raj, and that great individual, Mahatma Gandhi, continue to be of absorbing interest to the historians. But the history of independent India has remained a field mostly unsettled. If history is formally constituted knowledge of the past, then for the period since 1947, this knowledge practically does not exist. And yet, as this book shows, the first year of freedom were as full of dramatic interest as in the last years of the Raj. The British had formally handed over power, but authority had to be created anew. Partition had not put an end to Hindu-Muslim conflict, nor independence to class and caste tensions. Large areas of the maps were still under the control of the Maharajas. These had to be brought into the Indian Union by persuasion or coercion. Amidst the wreckage of a decaying empire, a new nation was being born and built. Of his recent history of post-war Europe, Tony Judell writes that a book of this kind rests, in the first instance, on the shoulder of other books. He notes that for the brief 60 years period of Europe's history since the end of the Second World War, indeed for this period above all, the secondary literature in English is inexhaustible. The situation in India is all too different. Here, the gaps in our knowledge are colossal. The Republic of India is a union of 28 states, some larger than France. Yet, not even the bigger or more important of these states have had their stories written. In the 1950s and 60s, India pioneered a new approach to foreign policy and to economic policy and planning as well. Authoritative or even adequate accounts of these experiments remain to be written. India has produced entrepreneurs of great vision and dynamism, but the stories of the institutions they built and the wealth they created are mostly unwritten. Again, there are no proper biographies of some of the key figures in our modern history, such as Sheikh Abdullah or Master Tara Singh or M.G. Ramachandran. Provincial leaders, each of whose province is the size of a large European country. Unlike a history of post-war Europe, a history of post-war India cannot simply rest on the shoulders of other books or more specialized subjects. In matters great and small, it must fill in the blanks using material picked up by the author. My first mentor, a very wise old civil servant named C.S. Venkatachar, once told me that every work of history is interim, to be amplified, amended, contested, and overthrown by works written in its wake. Despite the range of subject it covers, this book cannot hope to have treated any of them comprehensively. Individual readers will have their own particular grouses. Some might complain, for instance, that I have not said enough here about tribals. Others that I should have written even more pages on Kashmir. My own hope for this book are best expressed in the words of Mark Bloch, writing about another country, another time. I could liken myself to be an explorer making a rapid survey of the horizon before plunging into the thickets from which the wider view is no longer possible. The gaps in my account are naturally enormous. I have done my best not to conceal any deficiencies, whether in the state of our knowledge in general or in my own documentation. When the time comes for my own work to be superseded by studies of deeper penetration, I shall feel well rewarded if confrontation with my false conjectures has made history learn the truth about herself. 6. The great Cambridge historian F.W. Maitland liked to remind his students that what is now in past was once in future. There could be no better maxim for the historian, and especially the historian of the recent past, who addresses an audience with very decided views on the subject about which he presumes to inform them. An American historian of the Vietnam War is read by those who have mostly made up their minds on whether the war was just or not. A French historian of the student movement of 1968 knows that his readers shall have forceful, if mutually contradictory opinions about that particular upsurge. Those who write contemporary history know that the reader is not a passive vessel to receive the text placed before him or her. The reader is also a citizen, a critical citizen with individual political and ideological preferences. These preferences direct and dictate the reader's view of the past and of leaders and lawmakers most particularly. We live with the consequences of decisions taken by modern politicians and often presume that an alternate politician, someone modeled on oneself, would have taken better or wiser decision. The further back we go in time, the less of a problem this is. Historians of the 18th century seek to interpret and understand that time, and so, following them, do their readers. A biographer of Jefferson or Napoleon can count on more trusting readers. They do not presume to know the things those men did or wish they should have done them differently. Here, the reader is usually happy to be led and guided by the expert, but the biographer of John F. Kennedy or Charles de Gaulle is not so fortunate. Some, perhaps many potential readers already know the truth about those men and are less willing to hear alternative versions of it, even if they are backed up by copious footnotes. Contemporary historians thus face a challenge from their readers which their more backward-looking colleagues avoid. But there is also a second and perhaps less commonly acknowledged challenge. This is that the historian too is a citizen. The scholar who chooses to write on the Vietnam War already has strong views on the topic. The scholar who writes on the American Civil War could have less strong views, and one who writes on the Revolutionary War weaken views still. For the historian, as well as the citizen, the closer one gets to the present, the more judgmental one tends to become. In writing this book, I have tried to keep Maitland's maxim always in front of me. I have been driven by curiosity rather than certainty, by the wish to understand rather than the desire to pass judgment. I have sought to privilege primary sources over retrospective readings, that thus to interpret an event of say 1957 in terms of what was known in 1957 rather than in 2007. This book is, in the first instance, simply an attempt to tell the modern history of 1/6 of humankind. It is an account as well as analysis of the major characters, controversies, themes and processes in independent India. However, the manner of the story's telling has been driven by two fundamental ambitions: to pay proper respect to the social and political diversity of India, and to unravel the puzzle that has for so long controlled scholar and citizen, foreigner as well as native. Namely, why is there an India at all?